Yeah, okay. Well, maybe starting out with just how you feel about the canoe.
The hell kind of question is that? How do I feel about the canoe?
What has it meant to you, kind of, in your life?
Well, I'm a first generation Canadian, Mary, and have an arc that is very similar to other people's, but I'm very aware that my parents flipped a coin to decide whether they would go to South Africa or to Canada. My dad was in the British Navy. My mom was a midwife in the north of Scotland, and he had Navy friends in both places who could provide a beachhead, and so it was what it was, heads or tails. And so I became an accidental Canadian. And when I think of Canada, I think of canoes. And why is that? Well, I grew up on a river in southwestern Ontario. And somewhere early on, I read Paddle to the Sea by Clancy Halling. And eventually, when I was a bit older, a young teen, I guess, I saw Bill Mason's movie of the same, which became the most viewed movie in National Film Board history. I got the notion, and actually, I don't know if these windows are in the shot. The reason why these windows are in this little Chateau de Bateau in Sealy's Bay, these are my bedroom windows from where I grew up. And through those windows as a kid, like from 5 on, I looked out the window and saw the river. But after getting the idea from Paddle to the Sea that you could travel, I realized that that river outside my bedroom window, outside that window, was a passport to the North Pole or the top of Mount Everest, and that was the sort of the kid's dream. We didn't have a canoe. The next door neighbor had a canoe. We had a little sailboat that I carried and paddled like a canoe, but that original sort of prepubescent fantasy about water being a road to magical places has only been doubled and redoubled with every experience I've ever had. So I became a Boy Scout, and they had real canoes, and we actually put canoes in the river where I lived and paddled down the Speed River to the Grand River and eventually down to Lake Erie, and that led to travels in Haliburton and then in Northern Ontario and then to the Arctic, which go on. And so when I think of canoes, I think of friendships, I think of relationships, but more than anything, now, as an adult, I think of a nation of rivers that is also a river of nations. And I think of the diversity of expressions of the canoe idea from coast to coast to coast. And I think of the people who are connected to the landscape, the indigenous people. And I think now of all of the things that I've learned through that device, which is at once so gloriously simple and beautiful, but also incredibly complex. And now when I think about the kind of work that Chuck Command is doing, the kind of work that you're doing in building canoes, I think the canoe as an idea, I mean, they've been used to sell everything under the sun, from cars to cigarettes to feminine hygiene products to music to the Shaw Festival. It doesn't theater. It doesn't matter. So canoes are sort of in our consciousness, but I think canoes can actually, as a device in our consciousness, kind of get repurposed in the modern context as a kind of interstitial connecting device between and amongst cultures. And the work that is happening at the Canadian Canoe Museum, the work that is being done by builders like Chuck Commanda, and people like you with it's the Inner Harbor Commission, or no, Foundation?
Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor.
People like you with the Friends of Kingston Inner Harbor, who want to highlight the relationship between people and water, I guess in some big context, but also highlight the many different users, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and the canoe becomes this incredibly generative sort of project or context to put people's hands together in common purpose to make something that's beautiful and lasting, and you get a canoe too. The beautiful and lasting that comes out of it is friendship, a sense of identity and contact to the land and to the landscape through the materials, and also a sense of each other in kind of common purpose that is remembered or re-remembered in the handwork of building a canoe.
So,
well, this is a story about how I got a middle name. My cheap Scottish parents gave me a surname and a Christian name, James Raffin, no middle names at all, and that always confounded teachers who always had a box on the forms for your middle name. But I got a letter, be 10 years ago now, nice letter, well-written letter from a kid called Angel Peterson, who was on scholarship at Upper Canada College in Toronto. And he's from Kaluktuk, which is an Inuit community on the Coronation Gulf at the mouth of the Coppermine River. And he tells me in this letter that his teacher, Mr. Parkinson, said that he should write to me to help them raise money for a canoe trip, because what he'd really like to do is take some of his friends from this school in Toronto to his home in Nunavut. And his teacher told him that this guy, this totally faceless, nameless guy called James Raffin, might be able to help him get money from places like the Secretary of State, who had a kind of exchange budget, and the Royal Canadian Geographical Society had an expeditions budget. So I did that, and I helped them. And they got some money to go on this trip. And it was probably just a couple of months before the trip, I got a call from him that said, "Thanks, we got the money. Would you like to come?" I said, "Sure, sign me up." And so it was kind of an interesting blend of Southern youth and Northern youth. There were a couple of parents. It was guided by Black Feather, a company that I'd used to guide for on that same river. But I was just kind of the old guy on the trip. And I took with me on the trip a book by a guy called Keith Leckie that was brand new, that was about a murder that had happened on the Coppermine River of two priests by some Copper Inuit a long time ago. And so we're learning about paddling the river, and the guides were amazing. But the group is coming together around what's going on. I didn't say anything to anybody about the book that I was holding and reading at night in the tent. But we were going along, and we stopped on the lower river at one point, and we went for a walk. And on the top of the rampart of the side of the river, it's quite a dissected valley lower down, we came across a cross and a cairn, maybe 50s, 60s, but it had the little sort of Celtic ends cut into 2x4, and it was obviously, a loved piece of very simple a rugged cross stuck into this cairn of rocks. And we looked at the cairn, and there was a broken jam jar in the bottom, but it had protected a note that said that the Bishop of the Arctic in 1962 or something, this is in pencil on paper, marked the spot where these two fathers, Jesuit or Catholic priests, had been killed, murdered. And by this time I'm well into the book, and it's pretty clear that it's not a cut and dried murder situation. It's very conflicted and contested, of these people of the cloth showing up to a community that is doing fine, but the resources are very limited, and to have 2 extra mouths to feed is not good. Anyway, that night around the campfire, I brought out this book because it totally related to what we had found on the ground. And I read the piece of the book which talked about the actual events that had presumably taken place right where we were. And I said, okay, that's what this writer says happened here. And this is going on way too long, but never mind. What happened I said, that's what the history books are telling us happened here. But there are other kinds of history. There's oral history too. What do you people know about this story? And of course, everybody from that community who was there had heard something about that story. And Kenny Taptuna, who was one of the Inuit teachers who was there, knew quite a bit about it and was actually related to Patsy Klingenberg, who was one of the characters in the story. And it was an amazing event insofar as it was south and north, it was Inuit and non-Inuit. And what brought us together was this wacky canoe trip. And they were the first people from that community to arrive in the community at the end of the trip. We arrived on Nunavut Day, I forget what year it was, and they were greeted as heroes when they came to town. And partly as a result of my helping on that trip, but later on that trip, the kids had a little ceremony on the side of the river, and they decided I should be called Ayuituk, which in the Raffin dialect of Inuktitut means the place that never melts. And in the Inuinnaqtun, the dialect of the Copper Inuit, I joked and said, yeah, it means an old white guy. And they said, no, it actually means teacher or mentor. But that was an example that probably has been played out in many, many times of a canoe, which is not an Inuit device. I mean, the kayak is an Inuit device, but the canoe as a foil or a context for bringing people together allowed the people at that circle to understand that the privilege of a fancy education, which would tell you that the truth is contained in books, learned that the truth is also contained in stories and in oral history. And in my experience, which sadly Mary yawns on, I've been canoeing for a long time, but that is probably one of the absolute highlights of my life. And when people now push to say, what is your middle name? For example, Guelph University gave me an honorary degree a few years back, and they said, what name would you like on there? And I said, I would like to be James Ayuituk Raffin.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so, well, let's switch gears totally, and let's move into you know, how Canada would not be Canada without the canoe. Like, you know, what kinds of interactions, as far as in your understanding about, you know, the early explorers and map makers, and their the kind of lives that they lived, and the way that Canada became a country early on, like that. Really simple questions I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you read the history of the French in Canada, who were very quick to, much quicker than the English, to get in the craft of the indigenous people they encountered, and to employ the craft to explore or to access the country. It became very clear to early people from France that this was the device to move into the country. British explorers, the Hudson Bay Company in particular, stuck to the coasts and were more reluctant to get into canoes. But it doesn't matter what commercial enterprise, what communication enterprise you examine, what sort of trade premise, what kind of interregional or interprovincial relationship that you might be exploring in a contemporary context. If you dig down in any of those categories or paths in this country, eventually you'll get to communication, energy, ideas, technology, notions of innovation that attach back to the canoe. And it doesn't matter where you are in this country. If you have people who had a yen to move or to communicate, and they turn to local materials to produce a device to solve the problem of communication, connection, that sort of thing, a canoe results. And so in Newfoundland, the Beatsuk had a really funny looking canoe with a hogged sheer, upwardly curving. If you look at the classic Algonquin canoes in the middle of the country with a beautiful shape that we all know to be a canoe, but the people in the Kootenay region of BC, they have these sturgeon-nosed canoes, which always made me laugh. If you give a school kid a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper and say, would you make a canoe out of this? They'll roll the ends over, and somebody will say, well, that's not a canoe. Well, indeed, that's a sturgeon-nosed canoe that you find in the Kootenay region. And there are canoes elsewhere in the world. For example, on the Amur River that separates Mongolia from Russia, there are the same sturgeon-nosed canoes. And there'd be a really interesting study to figure out how they relate to the interior of BC. But this country called Canada has this device, this idea, this vessel with which indigenous people, French people, and English people, sort of the three founding cultural groups, have some sort of common experience. And so the nation was founded on that, in a sense. And the nations of the indigenous people who were here before contact that was the vessel of commerce, that was the vessel of connection long before we came here. It took the sort of European mindset to take an idea and expand it, and so you go from mid-sized trade canoes pre-contact that might be 20 or 22 feet, and all of a sudden you've got these canoes de maître, like 36-footers. That will hold, the equivalent of a couple of Volkswagens and a case pop. That sort of adaptation of canoe was something that was done in consultation with, but using the idea and moving forward from that. But I don't think it's an accident now that there is a bit of a resurgence as the country is striving to sort of re-understand itself in the light of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it turns out that a canoe is not only a powerful idea, building canoes is a really useful activity because it's kind of accessible. And Chuck Command is a wonderful example of that. And I just actually had a chat with him about his work. And I asked him, I said, Chuck, you know, you're a perfectionist when it comes to doing the work that your grandfather did. And I know your grandfather was a perfectionist when it came to that. So what is it, you know, when you... I said, I've been to the middle of some of your builds and I've just shaken my head thinking, oh man, this is not going to work because there are all these people and they don't know anything about woodworking and they're cutting themselves and they're splitting the wood badly. And he said, well, perfection is a wonderful thing. And he said, perfection when you're wanting to build a canoe together means that if there's an improperly done lashing by somebody who had the best intentions and the purest of heart to do that, that needs to stay the way it is. He said, you know, when I was younger, I used to, when people would go home at night from a build, I would undo all those bad lashings and then do them properly. He said, I don't do that anymore because people want to say, I did that, and that was part of who I am. And in a lot of ways, the country is like that too. And the canoe reminds us that perfection does have many faces, and that it's not sort of symmetry and conventional notions of you know, color gradation and form that define beauty. There are many other types of beauty as well that have to do with getting along, that have to do with being patient, and that have to do with understanding different perspectives. And I think a canoe has a lot of things to teach us about that. But instead of being kind of out there, as you know, Mary, as a result of your build, it's a kind of a welcoming circumstance. And as such, I think it's a very powerful device that more communities and more organizations should think about as a way of bringing people together.
So in a way, as truth and reconciliation, although, you know, I'm sort of, I hear a lot of people really uncomfortable with that term because they think it's a sort of colonial term. I don't know, you know, have you heard that discussion about truth and reconciliation not being good, but indigeneity being something that people should be striving towards? And if so, what is indigeneity?
I think there have been some breakthroughs for me on that topic, on the topic of what is indigeneity and what is the obligation of a so-called settler to understand and appreciate that. A couple of moments. One, Ron Wheatung, a Canadian Canoe Museum board member who joined us on a journey called Connected by Canoe, where we paddled from Kingston to Ottawa in 2017 to have a conversation about the country. And Ron just said, I think reconciliation is going to take generations. He said, what we need to do is get some truth here about what really went on. And seeking truth let the reconciliation happen. So if you seek truth from an Indigenous person who you know, meaning having a meaningful interaction with that person about something or in the process of doing some kind of activity, there will be learning and understanding that grows out of that maybe one day could be called reconciliation. The notion, I don't want to get hung up in the semantics of what is indigeneity and what is not. I will say this, that the more voices we hear of Indigenous people through poetry and art and music and conversation, radio hosts, public speakers, artists, the more we can hear from people of Indigenous origin, from Indigenous communities, I think the more learning will happen. And whether you call that, what you call that, I think it has to do with kind of rethinking about what's fair, what's equitable. So in my practice, I do as much as I can to work with Indigenous people whenever I can. It always results in important learning. It usually involves some kind of embarrassment about stupid practices on my part, or almost invariably involves putting my foot in my mouth somehow, because our privilege is so ingrained. But that has shown to me the beauty and the patience and the wisdom of people like Chuck Commanda, who are prepared and who have the generosity of spirit to listen and to reach out. And I am very grateful for those kind of people. But in the same way that angry settlers may have a point to make, but they're really hard to deal with, there are angry Indigenous people who, I understand and appreciate their anger, but they're not the best ambassadors for bridging gaps and for building understanding. So it takes all types, but I don't know what, I'm talking myself into just a weird little spiral here.
That's fine. So I guess, what kind of advice would you give to non-Indigenous people who are scared, who kind of are at the edge of beginning to understand that, they don't know very much about Indigenous culture, and they don't appreciate their role in the history, but they're afraid to take a first step, because it is kind of overcoming fear on all sides, really, and being willing to take that step or steps, or I don't know, what would you say to someone who says, well, what do I do? Is there a novel that I can read or something,
So yeah, I mean, I understand the fear, but if there was ever a time to reach out, now is that time. I think the context is much better. But yeah, I mean, you can do that from the privacy of your own computer or your own library. And so yeah, pick up a book by Tom King, and many, many other Indigenous authors who have incredible things to say. That is a form of learning that might take you beyond. But there are events all over the place. There are canoe builds all over the place that you can get involved with. There are organizations like Inspire who are doing amazing things for Indigenous youth, Indigenous people. That need money and need, I mean, that is a contribution to your own learning by committing your own personal resources to learning. I mean, similarly to the way that you're serving as a volunteer to make this build happen in Kingston. I mean, that is you call it what you will. It's an act of reconciliation. It's an opportunity, but it's a commitment on your part to enter the cross-cultural gap, if you like, to invite people into a place where new learning is possible. And I think the thing that I've learned about this is that it is going to be sometimes really awkward, and we need to embrace awkward. So here's a situation. The project called Connected by Canoe started at the rowing club in Kingston, and we had a group of people. We were getting ready to paddle. We had all sorts of, we had Indigenous, new Canadians, we had people of all different stripes in a big canoe that turned into 6 big canoes by the time we got to Ottawa. But right at the beginning of that project, there was a Mohawk woman came storming over with her child, and she was absolutely beside herself, saying, what are you doing? Where are your water keepers? Where are your women? What do you... And you've got your nerve doing, you know, this sesquicentennial project. And it was really quite uncomfortable. And as it turned out, we had Anishinaabe women as part of the group, and we were able to say, let's have a conversation about that. But she never did calm down about, she was really angry about an organization, the Canadian Canoe Museum, that would say we're having a conversation about Canada, and she'd made some assumptions about what was going on. We were really trying hard, and it wasn't a perfect situation, but it was a situation that allowed her to come and provide her perspective, and that, whether she knows it or not, set a kind of a context for the trip, where we did talk about some difficult things, including that kind of outburst at the beginning of the trip with our water keepers as our well, Shaylin Wabagishik, who spoke to her that day, I mean, she sang in the Sealy's Bay Hall when we stayed the night here. She sang a beautiful water song, Wishita Dedu. And that for people in town here was awkward. Another moment here. So we have Indigenous elders with us on this canoe trip. We're having a meal in the Sealy's Bay Community Hall coming through here. Our local minister, Don Stiles, who's a wonderful guy, a Newfoundlander. We've got the elder ready to say a few words before the meal, and we've got the pastor, the padre, ready to say grace. And there's actually a photo of the three of us standing there laughing because it was kind of awkward. Like, who goes first? You know, is it? But I've come to realize that if you're not prepared, you must be prepared to deal with awkward, because awkward actually often leads, and more often than not, leads to new learning and deeper friendships. Here's another example. Circumstance conspires that I'm the captain of the only Canadian vessel on the Thames River in London, England, in June of 2012 to mark Queen Elizabeth's 60th years on the throne. Do that, huge coverage, come back, and there's a letter on my desk at the Canadian Canoe Museum because it's from the new chief at Curve Lake, Phyllis Williams, who's become chief sort of since I've been away. There was an election. And it said, "Dear James, saw you on TV with Peter Mansbridge and in London, great, everybody. But the council wants to know, why were there no Indigenous people of the 8 people who were in that canoe with you on the Thames?" And the answer is, there should have been. And instead of writing her some mealy-mouthed letter back, I got in the car and I drove up to meet Phyllis Williams. And we've been fast friends ever since. She's not chief now. But that's another example of my own learning. Like, the next time I get invited to mark something on the Thames River in England and have to report to Her Majesty's Coast Guard about the seaworthiness of my vessel and to show them my credentials as a captain, which all the other people in the other 1,000 or 1,200 boats had to do. The next time that happens, for sure, there will be Indigenous people in the canoe or the vessel. But that's awkward. It was awkward. And but it took the courage of the chief to say, "Hey, what's up?" And it took, the teaching of my parents to, instead of duck what was a bad circumstance, to look it in the eye and to go and say sorry. And that has led to some wonderful outcomes. And I'm not Pollyanna here, because sometimes those confrontations don't end well. But on the other hand, if we aren't prepared to confront our own biases and our own narrownesses of mind on both sides, we're not going to fix the problems that are so apparent every day when we read the news.
Yeah. Okay, so.
Yeah, well, when I was doing the early work for the Gananoque water trails, we found a map that actually, we reckon, shows a portage coming up the Gananoque River that's probably 6,000 years old.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. So these should be public right-of-ways.
Yeah,
Is that?
well, it was Harper, I think, who changed the Navigable Waters Act. I mean, theoretically, if it was a navigable waterway, you were entitled to navigate it, right? And that, whatever that required.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been jimmied around a little bit.
Well, I think I have to get my head around that just out of curiosity, because I find that, yeah, it's one of the, like, so your mother was Scottish, you said?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the right to roam in Scotland
Mm-hmm.
is just so wonderful.
Yeah.
And the right to portage should be in law here, really, for any of these ones. Anyway, okay, so about silence and reflection.
It's hard to know where to start, but of the many things I have learned in my own work and practice with work in Indigenous communities and projects with Indigenous people, is that we settler types, Western types, talk too much, and we like to hear our own voices, and that probably one of the best things you can probably do is be quiet. And as a result of that, a canoe is one of the places that have taken me to places where the absence of conversation, well, on solo trips particularly, but even with other people, you can really appreciate the importance of silence and the importance of quieting the mind. And sometimes with the rhythm, I mean, I just did this. Every year on the day of the first snow, I go on what some of us call the Bill Mason paddle, which is referring to a scene from his last film, Water Walker. But I was just out last week with the dogs in the canoe. But that cadence of the paddle bumping the side and bumping the gunnel and just out, and the rhythm is its own kind of meditation. And you can go places in your mind that you can't. And I think one of the things that Chuck Commanda teaches us as we get into a build, I mean, he's just down from Chapleau, which was the next one after yours. But there are, many, many minutes, and if you're just working with Chuck, hours can go by and nothing is said. But doesn't mean there's no communication going on. The canoe is in many ways, for me, a vessel that takes me to places where I can sit and think and reflect in ways that I can't with the 60-cycle hum of hydro or the incessant chatter that we engage in as a matter of course, but shutting off devices and just letting the silence speak. And I think that's something that people I admire, particularly writers like Thomas Merton and others, you know that that kind of ascetic that can come from extended canoe journeys is important for figuring stuff out and figuring how things fit together. And it's very much attached in my mind to the experience of canoe.
Okay, there we are. So just a few things around here.
That's my little shrine to Bill Mason over there. I did his life story,
Yeah.
book called Fire in the Bones.
That's Bill?
Yeah, that's him in
Wow.
his studio, and that's a pencil drawing that he did for a book I edited with Bert Horwood called Connexus. But it's all faded now. But Bill was classic. So this was a postcard from Bill, you know, saying something to me, but it had got ripped up somehow and taped together, and so he still sent it. And anyway, the ink's all. But I like this Bill. That's me taking that shot. He's sitting at his light table in his little studio. And I don't know what he was doing, but he was sort of on stage most of the time. But this is a really kind of thoughtful Bill. And as the editor of the book, I was entitled to one of his pencil sketches. And anyway, that's migrated out here too.
Nice.
Okay, well done.